Imagine discovering that your entire family, dad, mom, sister, had deliberately kept you hidden from her wedding. Not by mistake, not by forgetfulness. They planned it all along. And while you were working alone in the middle of the night, they were using your credit card, without your knowledge, to pay for that extravagant party. Nearly $30,000. If you want to know what happens next, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed. This is my story. I found out about my sister's wedding the same way I find out about most things in my family. Completely by accident and 4 days too late. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had back-to-back client meetings from 8 in the morning until almost 6 at night, and I came home to my apartment in Seattle with my heels in my hand and a half-eaten granola bar in my coat pocket that I'd been meaning to finish since noon. I dropped everything at the door, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down at my kitchen table to go through the stack of mail I'd been ignoring for 3 days. Most of it was nothing. A credit card statement, a dental reminder, a catalog for outdoor furniture I'd never ordered from. But near the bottom of the pile was a small cream-colored envelope with my mother's handwriting on the front. Loopy, careful cursive, the way she only wrote when something was supposed to feel official. I almost didn't open it right away. I thought maybe it was a birthday card that had arrived late, or one of those forwarded pieces of mail my mother occasionally sent when she found something she thought I'd want to keep. But something made me tear the flap open right there at the table, standing up, still in my work clothes. It was an invitation. Lila Marie Carter and Grant Edward Holloway request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration, Saturday, the 15th of March. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, very slowly, the way you read something when your brain is refusing to process what your eyes are seeing. Saturday the 15th. I checked my phone. It was Tuesday the 11th, 4 days. My younger sister was getting married in 4 days, and I was holding an invitation that had been mailed. Not called in, not texted, not hand-delivered, but mailed, with a postmark dated 6 days earlier. Which meant that even if the postal service had moved at its absolute slowest, this envelope had been sitting in someone's outbox while the rest of my family had presumably been busy with rehearsal dinners and floral arrangements and venue walkthroughs. I set the invitation down on the table. I walked to my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and just stayed there for a moment with the silence of the apartment pressing in around me. Lila was getting married in 4 days, and I had just found out. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because I know how this is going to sound to people who've never been the dependable one in a family that runs on the fuel of one person's reliability. I know it sounds like I should have seen the signs. I know it sounds like maybe I was oblivious, or maybe the relationship was already so broken that this shouldn't have come as a shock. But that's the thing about being the capable one. You're always the last to suspect, because you've spent so many years being the person everyone turns to that it never once occurs to you that you could be turned away from. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 34 years old. I'm a senior financial consultant at a mid-sized firm in downtown Seattle, which is a title that sounds more glamorous than it is. It mostly means I spend 10 hours a day managing other people's money, solving other people's financial disasters, and sitting in conference rooms explaining things to executives who nod like they already knew. I'm good at my job. I've always been good at the practical things. Numbers, plans, strategies, logistics, the kind of problems that have real solutions if you're willing to sit down and work through them carefully enough. I became that person in my family long before I ever became it professionally. My parents, Richard and Sandra Carter, live in Portland. My father spent most of his career in sales. Insurance, mostly, and my mother worked part-time at a dental office reception desk until she stopped working entirely about 8 years ago. They're not bad people. I want to say that too, because this story is going to make them look like bad people, and I've spent a lot of time trying to be fair about who they actually are versus who I needed them to be. What they are, honestly, is people who never learned to live within a budget they could actually sustain. They like nice things. They liked the idea of the family they appeared to have more than the reality of the family they actually built. And somewhere along the way, I became the gap between those two things. The person who quietly made up the difference between what they had and what they wanted the world to see. It started small. It always starts small. A loan when my father's car broke down. $3,000, I think, that was supposed to come back to me in installments. It didn't. Then another loan when my mother needed a root canal that her insurance wouldn't fully cover. Then help with a month's rent when things got tight. Then 2 months. Then a situation that stopped being described as a loan at all and just became money I gave them because it was easier than watching them struggle and knowing I could have done something. I kept a spreadsheet. I'm a financial consultant. Of course, I kept a spreadsheet. $47,000 over 9 years. I looked at that number so many times it stopped feeling like money and started feeling like just a fact about my life. The way the weather in Seattle is a fact, or the price of rent downtown is a fact. Something you accommodate because it's simply the condition you're living in. Lila never contributed to any of it. Lila was the younger one, the pretty one, the one my parents always described to their friends with a kind of breathless pride that they never quite managed to attach to me. She was a graphic designer, freelance, inconsistent, the kind of career that sounded creative and exciting at dinner parties and paid roughly what you'd expect from something that sounded creative and exciting. She moved in and out of my parents' house twice in her 20s. She borrowed money from them constantly, which meant she borrowed it from me, indirectly, through the long chain of family finances I had quietly propped up for nearly a decade. I never said anything. That's the part I have to own. I grumbled to myself. I vented occasionally to a work friend named Priya, who told me repeatedly that I needed to set some limits, but I never actually drew a line. Because every time I got close to it, someone cried, or someone had a crisis, or my mother said something like, "Naomi, you're the strong one. You've always been the strong one." And somehow that sentence, which was supposed to be a compliment, was actually a trap I kept walking into with my eyes open. Bitti. The night I found the invitation, I called my mother. She picked up on the third ring, and I could hear the television in the background, something with a lot of canned laughter. "Naomi," she said, and her voice had that slightly elevated warmth it got when she was managing something. "Mom," I said, "I got an invitation in the mail today." A pause. Just a half second, but I felt it. "Oh, good. I wasn't sure if it would get there in time." "In time," I repeated. "The wedding is Saturday." "Yes, I know. Everything happened so fast. You know how Lila is." "When did you know about this?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Well, they got engaged back in—" "When, Mom?" She exhaled. "January. They got engaged in January." It was March. 2 full months. 2 months of family calls I'd been on. Sunday afternoon check-ins. A birthday dinner for my father in February, where the entire family had apparently sat around a table together discussing floral arrangements and guest lists and catering menus, while I sat there talking about his retirement account and whether he should rebalance his portfolio. "You didn't tell me," I said. "Naomi, you're always so busy." "You didn't tell me." I heard my own voice go flat in a way I didn't entirely plan. "For 2 months. You've known for 2 months, and you mailed me an invitation 4 days before." "Well, I sent it to everyone at the same time." "Did you send it 6 days ago to everyone, or did you send it to everyone else 2 months ago?" The silence that followed was the answer. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about all the ways I could have followed that question, with anger, with tears, with the full $47,000 accounting of everything I had given this family without once being made to feel like I was anything other than a service they occasionally used. I had all of it ready, somewhere underneath the numbness that was slowly spreading across my chest like cold water soaking through fabric. Instead, I said, "Okay, I'll let you go, Mom." "Naomi, I'll talk to you later." I hung up. I put my phone face down on the nightstand. I looked at the ceiling for a long time. The next day I called Lila. I told myself I was going to be calm about it. I told myself I was going to be the adult in the room, the way I was always the adult in the room, because someone in this family had to be, and it had always ended up being me. Lila picked up after the first ring, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. "Hey, you," she said, bright, a little rehearsed. "Did you get the invitation?" "I did." "I know it's kind of last minute. Things have been absolutely insane, Naomi. You would not believe the vendor situation we've been dealing with. The florist almost backed out last week, and then the caterer had some kind of staffing issue, and..." Lila, I stopped her. You've known since January. A beat. Who told you that? Mom did. By accident, I think. She was quiet for a moment. Then her voice shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way someone's posture changes when they stop pretending to be comfortable. Look, you've been really busy. You always say how stressed you are with work, and I didn't want to add to your plate. You didn't want to add the information that your sister is getting married to my plate. You know what I mean. I really don't. Naomi, her voice had an edge now. Can you not make this about you? It's my wedding. I almost laughed. I could feel it rise up in my throat and then just dissolve before it made it to my mouth. I'm not making it about me. I'm asking why I was the last person in our family to be told. You weren't the last. Was there anyone told after me? Silence. Lila, was there anyone in our family told after me? She didn't answer that. Instead, she said, Are you going to come Saturday or not? Because I need a head count. A head count? I was a head count problem. I looked out the window of my apartment at the overcast Seattle sky, at the strip of gray water you could see between the buildings if you stood at a particular angle. I thought about what it would mean to show up to that wedding, to walk into a room where everyone had spent 2 months discussing seating charts and song choices, and all the ordinary logistics of a celebration that my existence had apparently been a logistical consideration not worth including. I'll let you know, I said. I didn't go. I want to be honest about those 4 days between the phone call and the wedding, because I've had a lot of time since then to look back at them, and they weren't as composed as I'm making them sound. I cried. More than once and harder than I expected. Not the clean, dignified kind of crying that looks meaningful in movies, but the ugly, disorienting kind where you're not even entirely sure what you're crying about, the wedding specifically, or the 2 months of silence, or the 9 years of being the strong one, or all of it compressed into one moment sitting on your bathroom floor at 11 at night, wondering when exactly you became someone that your own family considered optional. I called Priya. She listened for about 45 minutes without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about her. And then she said very quietly, You already know what you need to do. You just want permission. What do I need to do? Stop going, she said. Just stop. Stop showing up when they don't want you there. Stop paying when they don't see you. Stop being the bridge when they're not building anything on the other end. I didn't answer her right away. Naomi, her voice was gentle. You can love people and still refuse to be invisible for them. I didn't go to the wedding. I texted Lila on Thursday evening, not Saturday, not at the last minute, but 2 days before, to give her time to adjust her head count. And I told her I wouldn't be attending. I wished her happiness. I told her I meant it. I did mean it, at least the version of it that was still accessible to me underneath everything else. She read the message and didn't respond. My mother called twice on Friday. I let it go to voicemail both times. Her messages said nothing specific. Just call me when you get a chance and just checking in. The kind of messages that pretend something isn't happening while it's happening. My father didn't call at all. He never did in moments of family difficulty. He was good at that, at not being present in a way that was so consistent you almost stopped expecting anything different. Saturday came. I went to the office. I know that sounds strange, going to work on a Saturday when your sister is getting married 300 miles away. But I want you to understand something about the way I'm built. I have never been good at sitting still inside pain. I have always been better at moving through it than waiting in it. So I put on a gray blazer and dark jeans, I made myself a travel mug of coffee, and I drove to the office in the quiet of the early morning when most of Seattle was still sleeping. The building was nearly empty. A couple of people from the legal team on the 4th floor, another consultant named Marcus, who was always there on weekends. I nodded at the security desk and took the elevator up to my office and sat down in front of 3 monitors full of spreadsheets and did the only thing I knew how to do when the world felt like it was sliding sideways. I worked. I worked through the morning. I worked through a lunch I ordered from the Thai place that delivered on weekends. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly report for a client in the pharmaceutical sector when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The kind of three-digit area code that usually meant a spam call, but something made me pick it up. "Is this Naomi Carter?" A woman's voice, formal, efficient. "Yes." "Ms. Carter, this is the Fraud Detection Department at Pacific Northwest Bank. We're calling because our system has flagged a series of transactions on your Visa credit card ending in 4471 that we'd like to verify with you." I felt the first cold shift somewhere in my stomach. Not alarm yet, just attention sharpening. "Okay. Have you made any purchases in the last 48 hours at a venue called the Montclair Ballroom in Portland?" I went very still. "Ms. Carter?" "No," I said. "I have not." "What about a company called Cascade Catering Services? A florist listed as Bloom & Codos? A jeweler called Hartley's Fine Jewelry on Morrison Street?" Each name landed like something dropped from a height. Cascade Catering, Bloom & Company, Hartley's Fine Jewelry. I knew before she finished the list what I was looking at. I knew it the same way you know when something has been true for a long time and you've been the last one to see it. That sick, lurching recognition of a shape you should have identified much earlier. "What are the total charges?" I asked. My voice was very steady. I was proud of it later for being steady. "As of this morning, Ms. Carter, the total unauthorized transactions on this account amount to $28,460. I put my pen down on the desk. Outside my window, Seattle was going about its Saturday. Someone's dog was being walked on the street below. A couple was sharing an umbrella across the intersection. Somewhere 300 miles south, in a ballroom paid for with my stolen financial information, my sister was probably getting ready to walk down the aisle in a dress I'd had no idea she'd chosen, toward a man I'd been told nothing about, in a ceremony built on a lie I hadn't even known I was living inside. "Ms. Carter, I need to let you know that per our fraud protection policy, we will be freezing this account immediately pending an investigation. Is that something you consent to?" I looked at the quarterly report still open on my screen. I thought about my father not calling. I thought about Lila asking if I was going to come as a headcount problem. I thought about the $47,000 in a spreadsheet on my personal laptop at home that I had never once asked to be repaid because I had confused being needed with being loved. "Yes," I said. "Freeze it." And then I said something I hadn't planned to say, something that came from the place that had been sitting quietly at the bottom of me for 9 years, patient and cold, and finally, ready to be heard. "And I'd like to know how I report this as identity theft and financial fraud." The fraud department representative's name was Claire. She had a professional, measured voice, the kind trained specifically to stay calm when delivering information that destroys people. And she walked me through everything with a patience that I will always remember as one of the stranger kindnesses of that night. She told me the transactions had begun 41 hours earlier, Thursday morning around 10 a.m. The first charge was the largest, $14,200 to the Montclair Ballroom in Portland, flagged as a deposit and final payment combined for a weekend event booking. After that, the charges came in waves. Cascade Catering Services, $6,200. Bloom & Cosi Floral Design, just under $2,000. A hair and makeup studio called Vella Bridal, $840. Hartley's Fine Jewelry, Morrison Street, Portland, $4,120. A linen rental company. A transportation service. 2 town cars, apparently, hired for the day. Small charges mixed in between the large ones. The kind of incidental expenses that accumulate around a celebration. A cake deposit, a parking reservation, a monogrammed item from a stationery store. $28,460. I wrote all of it down on the back of the quarterly report I'd been working on. I wrote it in my careful, column-aligned handwriting, the way I write when I'm processing something I can't yet afford to feel. Claire asked me to confirm which charges I did not authorize, all of them, every single one. And then she told me the account would be frozen within the hour and that a case number would be emailed to me within 24 hours for my records. "Miss Carter," she said, near the end of the call, and her voice shifted slightly from the official register to something just marginally warmer. "I want to make sure you're aware that given the nature and pattern of these charges, The geographic clustering, the timing, the vendor categories. This is going to be referred to our financial crimes unit rather than handled as a standard dispute. You'll be contacted by an investigator. I understand, I said. Do you have any idea who may have had access to your account information? I looked down at the list I'd written. Montclair Ballroom, Cascade Catering, Bloom and Copety Vella Bridal, Hartley's Fine Jewelry. A wedding. Someone had used my financial identity to pay for an entire wedding. I have some ideas, I said. Well, after I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time without moving. The building had gotten quieter around me. Marcus had left sometime in the last hour, and the legal team on 4 had probably cleared out too. The cleaning crew wouldn't come until Sunday evening. It was just me and the hum of the HVAC system and the city lights beginning to appear in the windows as the sky outside went gray, then darker gray, then the particular deep blue of a Seattle evening in March, when the clouds sit low enough to reflect the streetlights back down. I tried to think about it the way I would think about a client's problem. Systematically, laying out the known facts in a row and looking for the logical sequence underneath them. Someone had accessed my Visa card ending in 4471. That account was not a card I used casually. It was connected to my primary checking account, and I used it primarily for large purchases and automatic billing. My parents had that card number. I'd given it to my mother about 18 months earlier when her car needed an emergency repair, and she'd called me in a panic from the side of Route 26 saying the tow truck needed a card on file. I'd given her the number over the phone and told her to let me know what the total was so I could monitor it. She had. The charge came through, I paid it, and I had not thought about the fact that she now had 16 digits memorized or written down somewhere until this moment. Lila. Lila's wedding was at the Montclair Ballroom in Portland. Lila's wedding was Saturday. Today was Saturday. It was, according to the clock on my computer, 7:14 in the evening, which meant that whatever was happening in that ballroom, it was happening right now, or had just finished happening, or was in the process of falling apart because the bank had frozen the account an hour ago, and every vendor who hadn't yet been paid in full was about to find out their remaining charges had been declined. I picked up my phone. I had 3 missed calls, 2 from a Portland number I didn't recognize, and 1 from my mother's cell. I did not call any of them back. Instead, I opened my banking app, navigated to the fraud case confirmation, and stared at the case number for a moment like it was something I needed to memorize. Then I called Priya. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, how are you doing? Someone used my credit card to pay for Lila's wedding, I said. A long silence. Naomi. $28,000, ballroom, catering, flowers, jewelry, cars. All of it, on my card, without my knowledge. Oh my God. Her voice had gone very quiet. Are you sure? The fraud department just called me. They're freezing the account and referring it to their financial crimes unit. Naomi. She said my name again like she was trying to make sure I was still there. Are you okay? I thought about that question. I turned it over and examined it the way you examine something when you're trying to figure out if it's actually yours or just something someone handed you to hold. I don't know yet, I said. I think I'm still in the part where I'm just collecting facts. What are you going to do? I don't know that either. I paused. I know I'm not going to call them. Not tonight. Not from here. Good, she said immediately. That's good. Don't call them tonight. I just wanted someone to know what was happening. I know. I'm glad you called. A beat. Do you want me to come over? I looked around my empty office, the reports stacked neatly in their folders, the framed print of the Seattle waterline that I'd bought at a market 3 years ago and always meant to replace with something better, the single plant on the windowsill that I kept alive through what I could only describe as moderate diligence and occasional good luck. No, I said. I think I need to just sit with it for a while. Okay, call me if that changes. I will. I set my phone down. I picked my pen back up, and I started making a second list. Not of charges this time, but of everything I actually knew, laid out in the precise, unemotional language I used when I was building a case for a client, who had access to the card number, when they would have obtained it, what the charges suggested about the sequence of planning, what it would have taken, logistically, to make those purchases. whether someone had used the number remotely or whether they had manufactured a physical card, which was a more serious category of fraud. I worked through it for nearly an hour, filling half a legal pad. And when I got to the bottom of the second page and looked at everything laid out in front of me, what I felt was not grief anymore. It wasn't the hollow, winded feeling of being excluded. It wasn't even the particular exhaustion of being the person who is always strong, always steady, always available, and always last. What I felt was something I had not expected, and something I didn't entirely have a word for at the time. The closest I can get to it now is clarity, a cold, bright, cutting clarity. The kind that comes when you've been looking at a blurry image for so long that your eyes have adjusted to the blur, and then suddenly something brings it into focus, and you can see every edge. My phone rang again at 8:47, not the Portland number this time, my mother's cell. I let it ring 4 times, then I picked it up. Naomi. Her voice was a pressure front moving in, not the managed warmth of Tuesday night, not the checking-in softness of the Friday voicemails, but something raw and urgent that I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Something has happened. I know, I said. A pause. What do you mean, you know? I mean, the bank called me, Mom, about 2 hours ago. They flagged the charges on my Visa and froze the account. The silence on her end was a different kind than the ones I'd gotten used to over the past week. Not the calculated half-second of someone managing information, but the longer, airless silence of someone whose plan has just collapsed under them. Naomi, I can explain. I don't want an explanation right now. The vendors are calling. The caterer is saying the payment didn't go through, and the florist is threatening to take the flowers back. And there's an issue with the ballroom. Mom. My voice came out very even. It surprised me. I know. The wedding is... Her voice cracked, not with genuine grief, I thought, but with the specific desperation of someone watching something they built come apart in real time. Naomi, can you just call the bank? Can you just tell them it was authorized? Just for tonight, we can sort everything out on Monday. No. Naomi, no, I'm not going to do that. You don't understand what's happening here. Grant's family is here. His parents flew in from Connecticut, and it's embarrassing. It's so embarrassing. Everyone is standing around while vendors are on the phone arguing. I understand exactly what's happening, I said. I've been looking at the transaction list for the last 2 hours. I understand every single line of it. Another silence. Then her voice shifted again, from desperation into something harder, something that had an edge I recognized from childhood. The voice she used when she had decided that offense was a better position than defense. Naomi, we were going to pay you back. We have always paid you back. I almost said something about the spreadsheet. I almost read her the number. $47,000, 9 years, a list of transactions that had never been repaid and had stopped being framed as loans somewhere around year 3. I had the legal pad in front of me. I could have done it. Instead, I said, you used my financial identity without my knowledge or consent to fund a wedding I wasn't invited to. Do you understand how serious that is? We just used the card for a few things. It was an emergency, the vendors needed payment, and $28,000, Mom. That's not a few things. She went quiet. That's not borrowing money and forgetting to mention it. That's not a gray area. The bank's fraud unit is already involved. They're going to investigate. You called the fraud department? Her voice had a new quality now. Disbelief, maybe? Or something closer to betrayal? The particular kind of betrayal that belongs to people who expected their victim to stay quiet. Naomi, you called the bank on your own family? And there it was. That sentence. You called the bank on your own family. As if the logical sequence of events was that someone steals from you, and the theft is something that happened to them when you report it. I want to stop here for a moment, because I need you to understand what that sentence did to me. Not right away, but eventually, in the weeks that followed when I had enough distance to look at it clearly. That sentence was the entire architecture of the last 9 years of my life, compressed into 9 words. You called the bank on your own family, as if family were a category of relationship that superseded theft, as if being someone's daughter meant you were required to absorb whatever they took from you without making it a legal matter. as if my $47,000 and my credit card number and my financial identity and my dignity all belonged, in some fundamental way, to them, and I was the transgressor for reclaiming them. Yes, I said. I called the bank because someone used my account without my permission. She hung up. Bye. For about 15 minutes after that, I genuinely didn't know what to do with myself. I paced my office, 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back to the desk, the way you pace when you're too keyed up to sit but too stunned to think of anywhere to go. The city outside had gone fully dark and the rain had started, which in Seattle in March is less of a weather event and more of a state of being, and I watched the water streak down the window glass and tried to get my breathing to slow down. My phone buzzed. A text, not a call. From a number I didn't have saved, but with a Portland area code. Naomi, this is Grant Holloway, Lila's husband. I got your number from the contact list in her phone. I hope that's okay. I think we need to talk. I stared at the text for a long moment. Grant Holloway. The man who had apparently married my sister 6 or 8 hours ago in a ballroom paid for with my stolen financial information, surrounded by family who had collectively decided I was either unnecessary or inconvenient or both. I typed back, "What would you like to talk about?" His response came in under a minute. Everything just fell apart here. The caterer left. Half the vendors are saying their final payments were declined. Lila's parents are... I don't know how to describe what's happening. Can I call you? I thought about it. I thought about what Priya would say, which was probably something cautious about not engaging until I'd spoken to someone legal. I thought about what the fraud department investigator would probably say, which was something about not discussing the case with people who might be connected to the incident. I thought about what I would say to a client in this situation, which was to stop talking to everyone involved until you understand what your actual position is. Then, I thought about a man who had, apparently, just had his wedding reception collapse around him, and who was, from the tone of his text, starting to realize he might not have had the full picture of what he'd married into. "Give me 10 minutes, I typed back. I used those 10 minutes to splash cold water on my face in the office bathroom, drink the rest of my cold coffee, and look at myself in the mirror for a moment in the way you look at yourself when you're trying to remember who you actually are underneath everything that's happening. I looked tired. I looked like someone who had been at the office since 8 in the morning and had discovered a major financial crime in the middle of a quarterly report. My mascara was not a disaster, but it was not a success either. I looked like a real person, is what I'm saying, not composed, not pulled together, not the strong one. Just a woman in a gray blazer standing in a fluorescent-lit bathroom trying to decide how much honesty a stranger could handle on the worst night of his life. I called him. He picked up immediately, and the first thing I heard in the background was voices, multiple, overlapping, with the strained quality of people trying not to shout in public and failing. "Hold on," he said, and I heard footsteps, a door closing, and then relative quiet. "Okay, hi, thank you for calling. Grant." I kept my voice neutral. "I'm sorry about tonight. I want you to know that whatever Lila told you about me, I didn't do this intentionally. I didn't freeze anything to cause a scene." "I know." He said it quickly, like he'd already worked that part out. The bank called the ballroom directly. They explained that the account was frozen due to fraud. And then I started asking questions. A pause. "Naomi, did you know about any of this? Any of the charges?" "The bank called me at 7. I didn't know before that." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you know whose idea it was?" I chose my words carefully. "I know who had access to my account information. I know when they got it. The fraud investigation will establish the rest." Another pause. Longer. "Lila told me her family was contributing to the wedding costs. She said her parents had money set aside." His voice had a careful quality, the voice of someone who has just realized they've been standing on ground they didn't understand and is now checking each step very deliberately. I pushed back once because the budget I thought it seemed high for what her parents could manage. She said her sister had offered to help. I closed my eyes. "I didn't offer to help. I know that now." "Grant?" I kept my voice level. I'm going to cooperate with the fraud investigation. I don't have a choice about that, and honestly, I wouldn't make a different choice if I did. But I want to be honest with you. What happens next is going to be difficult, and you're going to have to decide some things for yourself. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. My parents are asking me what's going on. I don't know what to tell them. Tell them the truth, I said. Whatever version of it you know right now. It's going to come out anyway. It always does. I meant that as practical advice. I meant it as the thing I would tell any client sitting across from me in a conference room who had just discovered their situation was not what they'd believed it to be. But I also meant it in a broader way that had nothing to do with Grant Holloway specifically, a way that had everything to do with 9 years of a family telling a story about itself that required my silence to hold together. It always comes out. Every arrangement that depends on one person never asking questions, never pushing back, never demanding to be treated like their participation has value, it always, eventually, hits a wall. Not because the person finally gets angry, not because they make a dramatic decision to blow everything up, but because you can only sustain something on borrowed foundation for so long before the weight of it becomes more than the structure can bear. I hung up with Grant just after 9:30. I packed up my legal pad and my laptop and the quarterly report with the transaction list written on the back of it. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, nodded at the security guard, and walked out into the Seattle rain without an umbrella because I'd left mine at my apartment and hadn't thought to bring it this morning, which felt, in that moment, like an almost perfect metaphor for something I didn't have the energy to name. I got in my car. I sat there for a minute with the rain drumming on the roof. I thought about $28,460. I thought about $47,000 on a spreadsheet at home. I thought about my mother's voice saying you called the bank on your own family like it was the most logical thing in the world, like the thing I should have done instead was sit quietly and let it be taken. I thought about what it meant that I hadn't, for 9 years, ever once called the bank. I started the car. I drove home through the wet streets and the red taillights and the rain, and somewhere on the bridge over the water, I made myself a promise. Not a dramatic one. Not a cinematic moment of resolution where everything clarifies and the soundtrack swells. Just a quiet, specific promise, the kind that comes from the part of you that has finally finished processing and is now just done. I was done being the gap between what my family was and what they wanted to appear to be. I was done being the strong one who made it possible for everyone else to be careless. I was done carrying a structure built on the assumption that I would never, ever let it fall. The investigation was going to run its course, and this time, I was not going to be the one who made the problem disappear. The call came on Monday morning at 7:52 before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. I had spent Sunday doing the things you do when you are holding something enormous and trying not to let it crush you. I cleaned my apartment, I went to the grocery store, I called Priya and talked for an hour about nothing and everything. I reviewed the fraud case confirmation email 3 times without adding anything new to my legal pad. I slept badly, the way you sleep when your mind won't stop running calculations, and I woke up Monday with the particular grayness of someone who has rested without recovering. The number was my parents' landline. The number they'd had since I was 11 years old, the number I had memorized before I memorized my own, the number I had called from every school trip and every college dorm and every first apartment to check in and be the daughter who checked in. I answered it. My father spoke first, which told me immediately that something had been coordinated, because my father did not typically volunteer to be the first voice in a difficult conversation. He was a background figure in conflict, the kind of man who positioned himself adjacent to whatever was happening so he could claim proximity to the decision without accountability for it. Naomi. His voice was low and controlled in a way that meant he'd rehearsed this. Your mother and I would like to talk to you about what happened Saturday. Okay, I said. We think there's been a misunderstanding. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the counter. What's been misunderstood? I heard him exhale, not with emotion, but the exhale of someone preparing to deliver a position. The way you've characterized this to the bank. We used your card as a temporary measure. We fully intended to discuss it with you after the wedding when things had settled. The timing was poor. We understand that, But calling it fraud is, Dad, I kept my voice level. You used my account number without my knowledge or consent to charge $28,000 to vendors for an event I wasn't invited to. What word would you use? A pause. Then my mother's voice came on the line. She had been there the whole time, I realized, just waiting. And it had the heat in it that her voice got when she'd decided she was the aggrieved party. Naomi, we did what we had to do. Lila's wedding was in 4 days and the vendors needed final payment. We were going to pay you back. We have always paid you back. You haven't, I said. I have a spreadsheet. Silence. $47,000 over 9 years. I have every transaction documented. None of it was paid back. It stopped being called loans around 2018 and just became money I gave because no one ever acknowledged a repayment was expected. That is completely... My mother's voice broke off. I heard her say something to my father in a low, tight voice that I couldn't make out. Then she came back. That is completely unfair, Naomi. We are your family. We needed help, and you helped us because that's what families do. Families ask, I said. They don't take. We were going to ask, when, before or after the reception, before or after you mailed me an invitation 4 days before the wedding, so I'd find out too late to ask any questions? Was that part of the plan too, or was that just a coincidence? The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of people who have been caught, not in a lie exactly, but in the shape of one, the outline of an intention they hadn't put into words but had absolutely carried out. My mother was the one who broke it, and when she did, she said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. You have always had more than you needed, she said. You make good money. You have your career, your apartment, your whole independent life. Lila needed this. We needed to give her this. You could have helped, and it would have made no difference to you, and instead you chose to call the bank and blow up her wedding night because you couldn't stand not being the center of attention. I had to put my hand flat on the kitchen counter to keep myself grounded. Not because I was going to cry, I wasn't, or not yet, but because what she'd just said had a physical quality, the kind of statement that hits you somewhere below the chest and takes a moment to climb back from. She had just told me that my money was theirs by right of my having it. She had just told me that the fact I'd built something for myself meant that anything I had was fair to take. She had just told me that reporting a crime committed against me was an act of attention-seeking, and she believed it. That was the part that knocked something loose inside me. She wasn't performing injured innocence. She genuinely believed that the hierarchy of this family placed her comfort and Lila's celebration above my legal rights, my financial security, and my basic dignity as a person, and that my failure to silently absorb what had been taken from me was the actual transgression. I'm going to cooperate with the investigation, I said. That's not changing. Naomi, I'm going to go now, Mom. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment with my hand still flat on the counter and the coffee going cold beside me. Then I picked up my phone and texted the number the fraud investigator had sent me Sunday evening. I'm available to come in whenever is convenient. I have documentation going back 9 years I think you'll want to see. The investigator's name was Daniel Reeves. He worked out of a Pacific Northwest Bank financial crimes office in a building in downtown Seattle that looked like any other office building except for the security badge reader at the front desk and the particular quiet of the hallways, the kind of quiet that comes from people doing careful work. He was younger than I expected, maybe 38, 39, with a methodical quality about him that I recognized and respected immediately, the quality of someone who builds cases the way I build financial analyses. Brick by brick. No assumptions, no jumps, just the next verifiable fact laid on top of the last one. We met on Monday afternoon. I brought my legal pad, my banking records going back 3 years, and the spreadsheet, printed, 41 pages, every transaction I'd made to or on behalf of my family for the last 9 years, dates and amounts, and brief notations about context. I laid it all on the table in front of him and let him look at it without saying anything. He looked at it for a long time. Ms. Carter, he said finally, have you shown this to an attorney? Not yet. I have a call scheduled for tomorrow. He nodded slowly. You should keep that appointment. He turned a page. Can you walk me through the account access? When you believe the card number was obtained and by whom? I told him everything. The car repair, my mother's phone call from Route 26, the number given over the phone 18 months ago. The pattern of small charges in the months after that I now recognized as testing. 3 times over the following year, my statement had shown small charges from Portland area vendors that I'd assumed were errors and had disputed without thinking much about them. Small enough to fly under the fraud alert threshold. The kind of thing you notice and then forget about. The kind of thing that makes perfect sense in retrospect when you're sitting across a table from a financial crimes investigator, laying out the architecture of what was done to you. He took notes. He asked specific questions. The kind that told me he already had more information than he was sharing and was cross-referencing what I gave him against something else he knew. At one point, he excused himself and came back with a second investigator, a woman named Patterson, who shook my hand and sat down and asked me to repeat 2 specific pieces of information about the timeline. At the end of the meeting, Reeves leaned back slightly and said, I want to be transparent with you about where this is going because I think you deserve to know. He paused. The Montclair Ballroom has security cameras throughout their payment processing area. We've already obtained that footage. I looked at him. There are 2 individuals on camera at the venue's administrative office on Thursday morning at 10:14 a.m., the time the ballroom charge was processed. They presented what appeared to be documentation authorizing the charge. He held my gaze. We're going to need you to confirm identification from still images. But I want to prepare you. It was my parents, I said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. I will not pretend I was ready for what I felt when Reeves showed me those still images the following day. I will not dress it up into something more dignified than it was. I sat in that office with a bottle of water I hadn't opened and looked at 2 photographs. My father in the blue jacket he wore to every formal occasion, my mother with her hair done the way she did it when she wanted to look put together, standing at a payment counter, and something in my chest caved in that had nothing to do with the investigation and everything to do with the fact that these were my parents. These were the people who taught me to ride a bike and drove me to violin lessons I hated for 3 years and sat in the front row at my college graduation with a sign that said, "That's our Naomi," in my mother's loopy cursive. These were the people I had spent 9 years protecting from the consequences of their own financial carelessness, because I loved them, and because being needed by them felt, for a long time, like the closest thing to being wanted by them that I could access. And they had stood at a payment counter and authorized $28,000 on my stolen account information while I was 300 miles away, uninvited to the event they were paying for with my money. Miss Carter, Patterson's voice was careful. Take your time. I took a breath. That's my father, Richard Carter. I pointed. That's my mother, Sandra Carter. I signed the identification form. My hand was steady. I was proud of it again, the way I'd been proud of my voice on Saturday night. Not because composure is the goal in those moments, but because it was the only thing I could control. And control was what I had left. What happened next came in pieces over the following weeks, and I'm going to tell you about it the way I lived it. Not as a clean sequence of events, but as a series of moments that kept escalating past any ceiling I thought they'd reached. The first was Lila. She called me on Wednesday, 4 days after the wedding, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. Not the brightness she'd used when she called about the head count, not the defensive sharpness when I'd asked why I wasn't told. This was something raw, something that sounded like a person standing in the wreckage of something and not being entirely sure how they got there. I need to know if you're going to drop this, she said, without any preamble. No, I said, I'm not. Naomi, her voice broke slightly. My marriage is 4 days old. Grant's parents are... They're talking about an annulment. His mother called me twice yesterday. Twice. Do you know how that feels? I thought about being handed an invitation 4 days before the wedding. I thought about being reduced to a head count problem. I have some understanding of what it feels like to be in a situation you didn't create, I said. That is not the same thing. You're right, it's not, Because you knew what was happening and I didn't. I didn't know about the card, Naomi. I want you to know that. I didn't know how they were paying for things. I assumed. She stopped. What did you assume? A long pause. I assumed you'd agreed. Mom said she'd talk to you. I stayed very quiet. She said you'd offered to help cover some costs and that you and her were going to work out the details later. I didn't ask more than that because I was dealing with 400 other things, and Her voice dropped. I wanted to believe it. That's the truth. I wanted to believe you were helping. And that was the most human thing she'd ever said to me. Not in the way that made it better, but in the way that made it real. The admission that she had chosen, not out of malice, but out of the comfortable convenience of not asking inconvenient questions, to accept an explanation that allowed her to have what she wanted without looking too closely at what it cost. I had done that too. For 9 years. I had been Lila in a different version of the same story. Did you know I wasn't invited? I asked. The pause before she answered told me everything. Mom said you were too busy. She said you'd probably feel overwhelmed and wouldn't come anyway. And you believe that. Another pause. I didn't push back. That's on me. There it was. No explosion, no dramatic reversal, no cinematic moment where she declared she'd been wrong about everything. Just a quiet, cornered admission from a woman who had wanted a beautiful wedding badly enough to not ask questions she knew might complicate it. I didn't hate her for it. I didn't forgive her for it either. I just let it be what it was. I can't drop the investigation, Lila. Mom and Dad are on camera. I heard her sharp intake of breath. What? The ballroom had security footage. They were there in person on Thursday morning. They authorized the payments. It's not a matter of disputed interpretation anymore. It's documented. She didn't say anything for so long that I checked the call to make sure we were still connected. Then, very quietly, oh my God. I know. Naomi, I genuinely didn't know they went there themselves. I thought. She stopped again, started again. I thought maybe they'd found the card in a drawer or something. I didn't know they'd actually gone in person, and it's called fraud, Lila. It doesn't matter which form it takes. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed again. Not into hardness this time, but into something hollowed out. What's going to happen to them? I don't know yet. The investigation is ongoing. Are we talking about criminal charges? I don't know, I said again. That depends on the DA's office. I'm not making that decision. But you could ask them to go easy. You could tell them it was a family misunderstanding. You could... Lila. I stopped her. Not unkindly, but firmly. I'm not going to do that. The conversation ended shortly after. Not with a door slamming or a declaration. Just two sisters running out of things to say on opposite ends of a situation that had already moved past the point where either of us could redirect it. The second escalation came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from an attorney's office in Portland. Not my attorney, someone representing my parents. A man named Goff, who spoke in the overly careful cadence of someone who had been briefed to feel out how reasonable I might be before committing to a strategy. He used the word civil several times. He suggested the matter might be resolvable through a civil restitution agreement rather than criminal prosecution. He said his clients were prepared to acknowledge that the transactions had occurred without explicit prior authorization and to commit to a repayment schedule. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Is there anything else?" A pause. Ms. Carter, I want to be candid with you. Your parents are in their 60s. A criminal fraud conviction would have significant consequences for people at their stage of life. I know how old they are, I said. I know exactly how old they are. A civil resolution would allow everyone to move forward without Mr. Goff. I kept my voice professionally neutral, the way I kept it in conference rooms when someone was trying to reframe a financial problem in their favor. I'm not a prosecutor. I don't control whether charges are filed. I've cooperated with the investigation and provided documentation, and that process is going to continue. I'm not in a position to offer any assurances about outcomes. He tried 2 more approaches. I let him finish each one before saying a variation of the same thing. At the end of the call, he said he appreciated my time and I said I hoped he had a good afternoon, and I hung up. I sat for a while after that. I want to be honest. That call was harder than it sounds in the retelling, because his point about their age was not a manipulative invention. It was a real fact. My parents were in their 60s. The legal consequences of a criminal fraud conviction at that stage of life were genuinely significant. I knew that. I turned it over in my mind for a long time, the way you turn over something with weight to it, looking for the angle where it felt different. But I kept coming back to the same thing. Not anger, not a desire to see them punished, something quieter and more durable than either of those. An understanding that accountability is not the same as cruelty, that the consequences of a thing are not an act of violence by the person who is wronged, that if my parents were facing serious consequences, those consequences had been set in motion the moment they drove to the Montclair ballroom on a Thursday morning with my account information and a plan. I hadn't put them in that position. They had put themselves there, and the only thing I'd done was refuse to be the person who pulled them out. The moment I hadn't expected, the one that still catches me off guard when I think about it, came on a Tuesday afternoon 4 weeks after the wedding. Grant Holloway called me. Not a text this time, an actual call. And when I picked up, he said, "I wanted to let you know that I've been talking to an attorney about the situation with the financial information and what Lila knew and what she didn't. I'm not sure how any of this is going to go." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. He was collateral damage in the truest sense, a person whose life had been shaped by information he hadn't been given. "I also wanted to tell you something." He paused. "When I called you that Saturday night, the way you talked to me, you didn't have to do that. You could have hung up. Most people would have hung up. And what you said about telling the truth, I've been thinking about it since." "I just said what seemed right." "I know, that's the thing. It was just straightforward. Nobody in that family talks to each other like that. I've been around them 6 months, and everyone talks around everything, you know? You just said the thing." I didn't answer right away. I thought about 9 years of not saying the thing. I thought about what it had cost me. "Grant," I said, "I hope you figure out what's right for you. I mean that." "Thank you." A pause. "For what it's worth, I think what they did to you was wrong. Not just the card, all of it." I held on to that for a moment, then let it go. It was kind. It was true. And it was far too late to mean what it would have meant if someone had said it years earlier. But that wasn't Grant's fault, and I wasn't going to make him carry that. We said goodbye and hung up, and I went back to the spreadsheet I'd been working on. A client's quarterly review, ordinary numbers, the kind of problem that has a solution if you're patient enough to find it. Outside my window, Seattle was gray and damp and completely indifferent to everything that had happened. The city does that. It keeps going. And in that moment, sitting at my desk with the rain on the glass and a client's numbers on my screen, I realized that was exactly what I was going to do too. Keep going. Keeping going turned out to be harder than it sounded on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I was still numb enough that it felt like a decision rather than a daily fight. The weeks after the investigation opened had a particular texture to them that I wasn't prepared for. Not the dramatic texture of confrontation. Those moments had already happened, and in some ways the confrontations were the easier part, because at least during a confrontation you know what you're doing and why. What came after was quieter and more grinding. It was the texture of waiting, of checking my phone and not knowing whether the next call would be from Reeves, from my attorney, from my mother, from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be a reporter who had somehow gotten wind of a fraud case involving a family wedding in Portland. It was the texture of going to work every day and sitting in meetings and reviewing portfolios and giving advice about other people's financial futures, while my own felt like it was suspended somewhere above me, waiting for the investigation to determine which way it would fall. My attorney's name was Karen Solis. She was a compact woman in her early 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and spoke in short, precise sentences that contained no wasted words. I liked her immediately and completely, the way you like someone whose competence is so obvious it bypasses the usual process of earning trust. She reviewed my documentation in our first meeting, the spreadsheet, the banking records, the legal pad from the Saturday night, the fraud case number and correspondence, and sat with it for longer than Daniel Reeves had, which I hadn't thought was possible. When she looked up, she said, "This is thorough." "I'm a financial consultant," I said. "I document things." "That's going to help." She set the papers down and folded her hands on top of them. "I want to walk you through what you can expect, and I want to be honest with you about the parts that are going to be uncomfortable." Okay. The criminal investigation is out of your hands. You've cooperated. You've provided identification. You've given them 9 years of financial history that establishes a pattern. That's significant. But the DA's office makes charging decisions independently. You may be asked to give a formal statement. You may be called as a witness if this goes to trial. You have no control over the timeline. I understand that. What you do have control over is the civil side. She tapped the spreadsheet. $47,000 plus the $28,000, $460 in fraudulent charges. That's a recoverable amount in civil court, and based on what you've given me, the evidentiary basis is strong. But I want to prepare you for the fact that civil litigation against family members is a long, emotionally expensive process, even when you have a clear case. I thought about the word expensive. Not the financial kind, though that was real too. The other kind, the kind that costs you sleep and appetite and the ability to sit in a quiet room without your mind running the same loops over and over. "I want to pursue it," I said. She looked at me steadily. "Are you sure?" Because I've had clients come in at this stage who were certain, and then 4 months in, when the family pressure escalates and the holidays hit and the calls get worse, they reconsider. I'm not saying you would. I'm saying I've seen it. "I'm sure," I said. And then, because she deserved the honest version, "I'm sure today. I can't promise you about 4 months from now, but I'm sure today." She almost smiled. "That's actually more honest than most people are in this chair. We'll work with today." Well, the family pressure escalated faster than 4 months. It escalated in about 3 weeks. It came from multiple directions at once, which I later understood was not accidental. My mother called twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and left voicemails I mostly didn't return. The messages cycled through phases with a regularity that would have been interesting if I'd had the emotional distance to study it. Guilt in the first week, injury in the second, a kind of thin, brittle anger in the third. My Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister who lived in Eugene and whom I'd seen maybe 4 times in the past decade, called once to tell me that the family was worried about me and that she hoped I would think carefully before letting things go further. My father sent an email. An actual email, which was so unusual that I stared at it for a moment before opening it, that was 3 paragraphs long and said, in its careful insurance salesman language, that he hoped we could resolve this privately because he didn't think either of us wanted to see it become a public matter. I read the email twice. I forwarded it to Karen. Then I went to the kitchen and made myself a bowl of cereal and ate it standing at the counter because I didn't have the energy to sit at the table and I didn't have the energy to make anything more complicated, and I thought about what it meant that my father had put himself in a position where he needed to send that email. What I kept coming back to was a specific phrase. I don't think either of us wants to see this become a public matter. The U.S. in that sentence. As if we were 2 parties with equal investments in the outcome. As if the thing becoming public was a mutual problem, rather than a consequence that flowed naturally from what had been done and who had done it. I didn't respond to the email. Karen advised me not to, and for once my instincts and my attorney's advice were in complete agreement. Dumb. What I did instead of responding to my family was something I hadn't planned and didn't see coming until it was already happening. About 6 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from a woman named Diane Forsyth, who worked at a community nonprofit in Seattle that offered financial education workshops for people who'd experienced economic abuse, which was a category I'd known existed in an abstract professional way but had never thought of as something that applied to me personally. She'd gotten my name from someone at Pacific Northwest Bank's Victim Services office, which had apparently shared my contact with her organization with my permission in a consent form I'd signed at the end of my second meeting with Reeves that I hadn't fully thought through at the time. "I want to be clear that we're not asking anything of you," she said. "We occasionally connect with people who've been through financial fraud within family situations because their experience is genuinely valuable to the people we serve. Some people want to talk about it and some don't, and both of those are completely fine." I was sitting in my car in the parking garage under my office building, having taken the call before going up. What would talking about it look like? An hour, maybe 90 minutes? A small group of people, usually 8 to 12, who are in various stages of recognizing and recovering from financial exploitation. They're not there to hear a success story. They're there to hear something real. I thought about that. Something real. I'm not sure I'm in a position to be a success story, I said. The investigation is still ongoing. My situation isn't resolved. That's actually better, she said. A lot of our participants are still in the middle of their situations. Someone who's in it and still standing is more useful to them than someone speaking from the other side. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 days and then called her back and said yes. The workshop was on a Thursday evening in a community center in the Fremont neighborhood, 8 people in a circle of folding chairs, the kind of setting that would have felt staged or performative if everyone in the room hadn't had the specific gravity of people carrying weight they'd been carrying too long. Diane introduced me briefly and then sat back and mostly let the conversation find its own shape. I told them what had happened, not the full 9 years in sequence. I didn't have the time and they didn't need the chronology, but the shape of it, the way it starts small, the way being needed gets confused with being valued, the way the language around the money slowly shifts from loan to gift to just something that happens without being named at all. The Saturday night phone call, the transaction list. The moment I heard myself ask how to report it as identity theft and understood, for the first time, that I'd been waiting to be ready to say that for years. A woman across the circle from me, she was in her 40s, with the careful stillness of someone holding themselves together by practice, said, "How did you know? How did you know it was okay to report your own family?" I sat with that question for a moment. "I didn't know," I said finally. I was terrified. I still have moments where I'm not sure I did the right thing. "But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." She nodded slowly, like that was enough. And I realized sitting in that circle that the thing people in that room needed wasn't certainty or a clean resolution. They needed evidence that it was possible to take the step without knowing how it would land. I drove home afterward and cried in the parking lot of my apartment building for about 10 minutes, not because anything bad had happened, but because something had shifted slightly. The way weight shifts when you've been holding something in one position too long and you finally adjust your grip. But it was at the second workshop 3 weeks later that I met Ethan Brooks. He was not a participant. He was there because the community center shared space with a local architecture firm that was donating design consultation to help the nonprofit improve their meeting rooms. And he had stayed late to take measurements and had miscalculated when the workshops ended. He appeared in the doorway just as Diane was closing the session, immediately clocked that he'd walked into something, and backed up so fast he nearly knocked a poster off the wall. Diane waved him in. "It's fine, we're done. Ethan, you met Naomi last time?" He hadn't. He put out his hand a little awkwardly, still clearly worried he'd interrupted, and said, "Sorry, I didn't realize you'd still be going. I can come back." "It's fine," I said. "We were just finishing." He was tall, with the slightly distracted quality of someone whose mind was running calculations I couldn't see, and he had paint or something on the left cuff of his jacket that he clearly hadn't noticed. I noticed it the way you notice a detail that tells you something true about a person. That he worked with his hands even when his job was drawing plans. That he wasn't performing anything. That he wasn't someone who checked his appearance before walking into a room. We ended up talking for 20 minutes while Diane locked up. He asked what the workshops were, and I gave him the honest version rather than the comfortable one, partly because I was tired of the comfortable version, and partly because something about the paint on his cuff made me feel like the honest version was safe. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That takes guts. Coming here and talking about it when it's not over." "Or it's just stubbornness," I said. "I've been told those are hard to tell apart." He smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes before it finished forming, and it occurred to me that I hadn't had a real conversation with someone new in months, hadn't talked to anyone who didn't already know the outline of what had happened, who wasn't approaching me with either the careful tread of someone managing my emotions or the careful tread of someone managing their own. He asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I said I was in the middle of a complicated situation. He said he'd noticed, and that he was asking about coffee, not the complicated situation. I said yes. Gah. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I know how it can sound. Like the arrival of a good man is what finally fixed things. Like Ethan was the reward at the end of the hard part. And that's not what happened. Things were still genuinely hard in the months when we were starting to spend time together. The investigation was ongoing. The civil case was in early stages. My mother had graduated from voicemails to letters. Actual handwritten letters on the stationery she kept in the drawer under the telephone that she'd had since I was a child. And they were harder to ignore than calls because they were there in my hands, in her handwriting, saying things that could have been kind in a different context, and in this context felt like they were designed to find the cracks. One letter in particular from April said, "I raised you. I know you, Naomi. I know you don't really want this. You've always been the one who held this family together, and I know that part of you knows that doing this is tearing us apart. You're stronger than this. Come home." I read it 3 times. I put it in the folder with the rest of the documentation Karen had asked me to keep. I sat with what it had made me feel, which was a complicated knot of things I didn't want to examine all at once. The pull of it, the genuine pull of it, because she was right that a part of me didn't want this. A part of me had never wanted this. A part of me had spent 9 years choosing not to want it in the hope that the choosing would be enough to make the family I needed them to be materialized out of the family they actually were. That part wasn't gone just because the investigation existed. It was still there, smaller but still present, the way an old injury still aches in certain weather, even years after it's healed. I didn't think it was weakness. I thought it was what love looks like when it survived something that should have killed it, diminished, a little ragged, still technically alive. I told Ethan about the letter on our 3rd time getting coffee, which had transitioned from a coffee shop near the community center to a place near my office because that was more convenient for me, and he'd adjusted without making it a thing, which I noted. He listened and then said, "What did you do with it?" "Put it in a folder for my attorney." He nodded. "Does it help to talk about this stuff, or does it just stir it up?" I thought about it genuinely. "Both," I said, "but the stirring is useful. I think I've been unstirred too long." That's an interesting way to put it. I'm a financial consultant. I live in spreadsheets. Emotional vocabulary is a work in progress. He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed at something I said, and I registered it with the specific awareness of someone who hasn't laughed easily in a while and notices when the muscles are working again. In May, I put in an offer on a condo in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. This is the part of the story where I could tell you it was a bold, symbolic act of claiming my own life, and there was some of that. But there was also the more practical reality that my lease was up in June. The market had a brief window that Karen's financial network helped me identify, and I had been talking about buying for 3 years and kept not doing it because there was always something else the money was needed for. There was always a family crisis. There was always a reason to wait. The offer was accepted on a Thursday. I called Karen first, then Priya, then sat with the paperwork spread across my kitchen table and felt something that wasn't joy exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular sensation of a door that has been stuck for a long time, finally moving on its hinges. The inspection revealed a crack in one of the bathroom tiles and a kitchen faucet that dripped, and a small water stain on the bedroom ceiling from a leak that had been repaired but not cosmetically addressed. All manageable, all the ordinary imperfections of a real place that real people had lived in. I signed the final documents on a Friday afternoon and got the keys and drove to the empty condo and stood in the middle of the main room in the late afternoon light for a while, just standing there, not performing anything for anyone. It needed paint. The previous owners had made a decision about the living room color that I could not explain and would need to address immediately. The kitchen counter had a burn mark near the stove that would bother me every time I cooked. It was mine. For the first time in my adult life, there was a place that was mine and only mine, that no one had a claim on, that I had paid for with money that belonged entirely to me and had not been redirected to anyone else's need before it could become something of my own. I called Ethan from the empty condo. "I got the keys," I said. "How does it feel?" I looked around at the walls that needed paint and the floor that needed rugs and the windows that let in more light than I'd expected. "Like something that belongs to me," I said. A short pause. That's a good thing, right? Yeah, I said. I think it really is. Egan. The promotion came in June, which my firm's director framed as long overdue, which was his diplomatic way of acknowledging that I had been performing at a senior level for 2 years while holding a mid-level title and compensation, and that the correction was being made now because they'd recently lost two other consultants to competitors and had become suddenly aware of who on their team they could not afford to lose. I was not under any illusions about the timing, but I took it anyway. I took it because the money was real, and the title was real, and the work I'd done to earn them was real, regardless of what had motivated the firm's timing. I've learned, slowly, imperfectly, still learning, to take things that are rightfully mine without waiting for the context around them to be perfect. The same month, I got a call from Diane about making the financial fraud workshops a more regular thing. Not just showing up occasionally, but helping design a curriculum specifically around financial identity theft within family relationships, drawing on my professional expertise as well as my personal experience. I said yes to that too. I was building something. Piece by piece, not dramatically, not in a straight line. I got the condo and then immediately had a week where the civil case hit a procedural snag that Karen explained required patience, and I responded to with a level of anxiety I wasn't proud of, involving 2 sleepless nights and a conversation with Priya that went in circles until she said, fairly but directly, "You're spiraling. Stop planning for outcomes you can't control and go do something with your hands." I painted the living room that weekend, badly at first. I taped everything carefully and still got paint on the baseboards, and then gradually better as I figured out the angle and the pressure and the rhythm of it. Ethan came over on the second day and fixed what I'd done to the baseboards without commenting on it, except to say the color was good, which it was, a warm gray-green that changed depending on the light. We ate takeout on the floor because I didn't have furniture yet. He told me about a project he was working on, a community library renovation in Rainier Valley, a building that had been neglected for 15 years and needed structural work before it could be anything else. He talked about it the way I talked about a client's complicated portfolio, with the particular combination of frustration and investment that belongs to problems you care about enough to solve carefully. I listened and asked questions, and somewhere in the middle of it, I realized that I'd gone almost 2 full hours without thinking about my parents. It wasn't peace. I don't want to call it peace, because that would make it sound more settled than it was. But it was a glimpse of what peace might eventually feel like. Not the absence of the hard thing, but the presence of enough other things that the hard thing no longer filled the entire frame. That was something. On the floor of my half-painted condo with takeout boxes, and a man I was slowly, carefully, without any particular plan beginning to trust, it was genuinely something. The doorbell rang on a Saturday morning in October, 7 months after the wedding that had been paid for with my stolen identity, and I knew before I even reached the door who it was. I don't know how to explain that knowing exactly. It wasn't intuition in any mystical sense. It was more like pattern recognition, the same thing that lets you see a financial trend before it completes. The accumulation of small signals over months that your conscious mind hasn't yet assembled into a clear picture, but your body has already understood. The letters from my mother had stopped in September. The calls had dropped off in August. The attorney Goff had gone quiet after Karen sent a formal response to his 3rd outreach attempt. And when things go quiet from people who have been relentlessly loud, it usually means they've changed strategy, not that they've changed their minds. I looked through the peephole. My parents stood on my front step. My mother had her good coat on, the charcoal wool one she wore when she wanted to signal that something mattered. My father stood slightly behind her and to the left, in the position he always took when my mother was leading something. He had aged in 7 months in a way I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. His shoulders were lower. There was something in his face that I could see even through the distortion of the peephole's convex lens. Something tired and folded in, like a structure that had been holding weight for too long. I stood at the door for a moment. I thought about not opening it. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely considered it. I had every legal and personal right to simply not open the door, and there was a version of me that was still so raw from the last 7 months that the sight of them on my step felt like a physical threat. The way the body responds to sudden sound, even when the sound turns out to be nothing dangerous. My heart was going faster than it should have been for a Saturday morning where nothing else was happening. I opened the door. My mother looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was small, and she was trying to figure out how bad the situation was before she committed to a response. Assessing, hoping. Naomi. Her voice was careful in a way that had no performance left in it, which was the most alarming thing about it. Sandra Carter without performance was a person I barely recognized. Can we come in? I stepped back from the door. They came in. My father looked around the condo. The paint job that was now professional because Ethan had helped me redo it properly. The furniture I'd bought piece by piece over 4 months, the bookshelves, the plant on the windowsill that was doing significantly better than the one in my old office because this one got more light. He didn't say anything about it. My mother sat down on the couch without being invited to, which was so purely her that it almost made me feel something warmer than I was ready to feel. My father stayed standing near the door, which also told me something. I sat across from them in the armchair I'd bought at an estate sale and had reupholstered because the original fabric was a color I couldn't live with. I didn't offer coffee. That sounds small and maybe it is, but I want to be accurate. I didn't offer coffee because the offering of coffee was a ritual of welcome and normalcy, and I didn't yet know what this was, and I wasn't going to perform normalcy over something that wasn't normal until I understood what they'd come to do. We need your help, my mother said. Those 4 words. Not I'm sorry, not I've been thinking about what I did, not anything that acknowledged the 7 months that had passed, or the investigation that was ongoing, or the civil case that was making its slow way through the legal system. Just, we need your help. As if the sequence of events between March and October had been a lengthy pause in our usual arrangement, and we were simply resuming. What kind of help? I asked. My mother looked at my father. He came away from the door and sat on the other end of the couch, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, which was the posture he used when he was trying to look sincere and sometimes actually was. The DA's office, he said. They've been in contact with our attorney. There's a real possibility of charges being filed, Naomi. Criminal charges. I know, I said. Karen keeps me informed. If you made a statement, he stopped, started again. If you told them that the situation was more complicated than it looked, that there was context, a family history of financial sharing that made the arrangement, Dad, I said it quietly. Stop. He stopped. I'm not going to do that. My mother's composure, which had been holding together at the edges, shifted, not into tears. She didn't cry easily, another thing she and I had in common that I'd never particularly appreciated until now, but into a tightness around her mouth that I recognized as what happened when she was containing something she'd decided not to say. Then she said it anyway. We are your parents, Naomi. We raised you. We gave you everything. Mom, I kept my voice level. I need you to hear what you just said. She stopped. You gave me everything. That's what you said. And maybe you believe that. But I need you to sit in this apartment, my apartment, that I bought with my own money, that no one helped me pay for, that exists because I have spent 15 years building something that belongs entirely to me. And I need you to look at this place and tell me honestly whether what you gave me explains any of it, or whether what you gave me is actually what I made of what I had, despite what was taken. The room was quiet. My father looked at the floor. My mother looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, and I spent a moment trying to identify it before I realized it was the expression of someone seeing something clearly for possibly the first time and finding the clarity unwelcome. We made mistakes, my father said finally. His voice was low and without its usual shape. Just the words, dropped on the floor between us. Yes, I said. You did. We're asking you to consider... I have considered it. I've been considering it for 7 months. I stopped and then continued because they needed to hear the whole thing, not a version I'd softened to make it easier to be in the room. I've considered it while I was cooperating with an investigation, while I was building a civil case, while I was buying a home and getting a promotion and teaching other people how to recognize what happened to me so they can protect themselves. I've been doing all of that while considering whether to protect you from the consequences of what you did, and I've decided I'm not going to. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My father pressed his lips together. This is not about punishing you, I said. I want you to understand that, because I think you've been telling yourselves that this is about punishment, that I'm doing this out of anger, or to make you suffer, or because I stopped loving you. And none of those things are true. I paused. I'm doing this because what happened was a crime, not a misunderstanding, not a family arrangement that got out of hand. You drove to Portland and used my stolen account information in person, and you did it while I was working 300 miles away, not knowing I hadn't been invited to the wedding. That's not something I can reframe into something smaller just because you're my parents. We were going to pay you back, my mother started. $47,000, I said. Over 9 years. I have documentation of every dollar. None of it was repaid, none of it. I wasn't saying it as an accusation anymore. I was past the point where it needed to be an accusation. I was saying it as the simple, documented truth that I had carried on 41 pages of spreadsheet for years before I'd been ready to do anything with it. I'm not angry about the 47,000. I was, but I'm not anymore. What I am is finished pretending it didn't happen. The silence stretched. Outside my windows, the October light was doing something particular. The pale, slanted light of a Seattle autumn that makes everything look both clear and slightly melancholy. The way the city gets when summer is definitively over and everyone has remembered how long the gray season lasts. My father looked up at me from the floor, and what I saw on his face in that moment was something I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely prepared for. Not the performance of remorse, not the calculated expression of a man trying to reach an outcome, but something genuine and small and very tired. A man who had lived inside a story about himself for 63 years and was, possibly for the first time, sitting in a room where that story wasn't being confirmed. It didn't fix anything. I want to be clear about that. His looking tired and genuine in that moment didn't undo the transaction list or the security footage or the 7 months or the 9 years. It didn't make me reach across and offer the help they'd come for. But it landed in me somewhere. It found the part of me that would always, at some level, recognize these people as my parents, and it sat there with that part of me in a way I couldn't dismiss. I love you, I said. Both of you. I want you to know that because I think you might stop believing it when I say what I'm about to say. But I love you, and I also can't save you from this. My mother's eyes went bright. Not spilling over, just bright. The investigation is going to reach whatever conclusion it reaches. The civil case is going to do the same. I didn't set those in motion to hurt you. I set them in motion because a crime was committed and because I have spent the better part of a decade being the person who absorbed the cost of this family's choices, and I am not able to do it anymore. I paused. I don't want to do it anymore. My father nodded once, just once. A single slow nod that meant something I couldn't fully interpret but felt like, at some level, an acknowledgement. My mother said very quietly, "What are we supposed to do?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think you need an attorney, and you have one. I think you need to be honest with that attorney about everything, not just the version of events that is most favorable to you. And I think—" I stopped and started again. "I think you need to stop building your life on the assumption that someone else is going to pay for it." She flinched. It wasn't a dramatic flinch, just a small tightening, the body's involuntary response to something that hits close to something true. They didn't stay much longer after that. There was nothing left to say that would move the outcome, and I think even my mother understood that. She stood up and straightened her coat and looked around my condo one more time with the expression of someone making a mental note of something they can't speak aloud. My father stood too, and he did something then that surprised me. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, just for a second, without saying anything, and then dropped it and moved toward the door. I let them out. I stood at the window and watched them walk to their car, and I watched my father hold the passenger door open for my mother, the small, habitual courtesy of a long marriage, and I watched them drive away into the pale October morning. Then I sat down on my estate sale armchair and put my face in my hands and stayed there for a while. Not crying exactly. Or crying, but the kind that doesn't ask anything of you, the kind that's just the body releasing pressure that's built up too long. I stayed there until it passed, and then I got up and washed my face and called Ethan. "They came," I said when he picked up. "I know. How are you?" "I don't know yet." I looked out the window at the street below, still visible from where I was standing. "Okay. I think," Not good, but okay. Do you want me to come over? I thought about it. I thought about what I actually needed, which was something I'd gotten better at over the past months. Not reflexively saying no because I was the strong one who didn't need things, but also not reflexively saying yes because I was afraid to be alone with whatever I was feeling. Give me an hour, I said. I need to just be with it for a minute. Okay. No pressure in his voice, no wounded note, no management of my answer, just okay. Ethan. Yeah? Thank you, I said, for being someone I can call. A pause. That's not a hard thing to be for you, Naomi. You know that, right? I didn't answer that immediately. I sat with it the way I'd been learning to sit with things that were good and true and slightly difficult to receive. Not deflecting them, not minimizing them, not immediately converting them into a joke or a practical observation to avoid the discomfort of being seen accurately. I'm starting to, I said. The investigation concluded in November. Karen called me on a Wednesday morning with the measured tone she used when she had significant information and wanted to deliver it carefully. The DA's office had filed charges, financial identity theft and fraud, 2 counts, against both my parents. The evidentiary package was, in her words, thorough enough that she expected a plea agreement rather than a trial, though she cautioned me that nothing was certain until it was signed. I sat with the phone in my hand after she hung up and tried to identify what I was feeling. I'd spent months anticipating this call, running through different versions of how I'd respond to different possible outcomes, the way I run projections on a client's financial plan for multiple scenarios. In most of those versions, I'd imagined feeling something clear, relief, or vindication, or a complicated grief. What I actually felt was quieter than any of those. Something adjacent to the feeling I'd had standing in the empty condo on the day I got the keys. Not joy, not triumph. Just the particular stillness of a thing that has been in motion for a long time finally coming to rest. I texted Priya. They filed charges. She called me immediately, and her first words were not congratulations or celebration. She knew me well enough for that, but just, how are you doing with it? I don't know. Okay. It's what I expected, but it still feels... I paused. I thought I'd feel more. I've been waiting for this for 8 months. You've been doing the work for 8 months, she said. The outcome isn't the finish line. You already crossed that a while ago. This is just paperwork. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Whether she was right. Whether the finish line had already passed somewhere in the months of doing and building and choosing, and this was just the formal conclusion of a legal process that had been running parallel to a different, more important thing that I'd been conducting quietly and without any official case number. The civil case reached resolution in January. My parents, through their attorney, agreed to a structured repayment plan covering the $28,460 in fraudulent charges, plus a negotiated portion of the documented 9-year financial history, not the full $47,000, because Karen advised me that pursuing the full amount would likely result in a prolonged fight that would cost me more in time and emotional expense than the additional recovery was worth. We settled on $31,000, structured over 4 years. It was not everything, it was real. My financial losses officially were restored. Not all of them. 9 years of giving doesn't reduce to a number that fits cleanly into a legal settlement. But enough. The plea agreement was entered in February. My parents pled to reduce charges. Their attorney had negotiated competently, and Karen had expected as much. And the sentence included probation, mandatory financial counseling, and formal restitution under the civil agreement. No prison time. I want to say that clearly because I know there are people who will read this and feel that the outcome was insufficient, that something larger was deserved, and I understand that feeling. I had it too, briefly, when Karen first outlined the likely plea terms. But here's what I came to understand, slowly, in the months of sitting with it. I had never wanted them to suffer. I had never wanted to destroy them. What I had wanted, what I had needed, was for the thing to be real. For it to be named correctly and documented and placed in the official record of what had happened, so that it couldn't be rewritten the way everything else in my family had always been rewritten. So that there was a version of events somewhere that did not require my silence to hold together. The plea agreement gave me that. Whatever else it did or didn't do, it established, formally and permanently, that what had happened was wrong, not a misunderstanding, not a family arrangement, not Naomi being difficult. Wrong in the eyes of a process that existed entirely outside my family's ability to manage the narrative. That was what I had needed. Leela and I spoke once during this period, in December, a few weeks before the civil settlement. She called on a Sunday evening, and I almost didn't answer, and then I did. "I heard the charges were filed," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Grant and I separated in September." I hadn't known that. "I'm sorry," I said. And I was, not with guilt, because her marriage's difficulties had roots that predated any decision I'd made, but with the simple, real sorrow of knowing that another person was in pain. "He said he couldn't get past the foundation of it," she said, "that everything he thought the family was had been built on something he didn't know about. He tried for a few months, but—" She stopped. "I understand it, actually. I think that's the worst part. I understand why he left." I didn't say anything. "Naomi." Her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not the brightness, not the defensiveness, not the cornered honesty of the phone call in March. Something older and more tired. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked how the wedding was being paid for, and I didn't because I was afraid the answer would complicate what I wanted. I know that's on me. "It is," I said. Not cruelly, just accurately. "I don't know how to fix it." "I don't know either." I meant that honestly. There wasn't a clear path back to what we'd been, partly because what we'd been hadn't actually been what I thought it was. And rebuilding something requires first agreeing on what you're building toward. I think it might take a long time, and it might not look like what either of us expects. "Are you open to it?" she asked. "At some point? Not now, I know, but eventually." I thought about that. I thought about the version of me who had stood at her kitchen table at 9:30 at night, holding an invitation with 4 days left, and felt the particular devastation of discovering you'd been deliberately made invisible in your own family. I thought about the version of me sitting in a financial crimes office, identifying photographs of my parents. I thought about the floor of my condo with takeout boxes and a man with paint on his jacket who had asked if I wanted coffee with a straightforwardness that had felt, in that season of complicated things, like water. "I don't know," I said finally. That's the honest answer. I don't know what I'm open to yet. I know I'm not closed. She was quiet for a moment. "That's more than I expected," she said. "I know." We said goodnight. It wasn't a reconciliation, it wasn't a door slamming. It was two people who share blood and history and a specific kind of damage trying to figure out if there's a version of the future where those things can coexist with something better and not knowing the answer yet. That's what it was. I'm not going to make it tidier than that. In March, exactly 1 year after the Saturday I found the invitation, I was invited to speak at a financial fraud awareness event hosted by a coalition of Washington state banks and consumer advocacy organizations. Not a small workshop in a community center this time, but an actual conference room with about 200 people in it and a microphone and a moderator who introduced me with a professional summary of my background and my case. I stood at that podium and looked out at 200 people who had come on a Thursday morning to learn about financial identity theft and how it happens within families, and I thought about what I wanted to say. I'd prepared notes, I had a clear structure in mind, and then I looked at the room, at the woman in the third row who had the specific stillness of someone who recognized something, at the older man near the back who was taking notes with the focused attention of someone collecting evidence, at the young couple near the aisle who kept exchanging glances that said, "This is what we came for." And I set my notes on the podium and talked without them. I told them about the spreadsheet. I told them about 9 years of being the strong one. I told them about the invitation in the mail and the phone call from the fraud department and the legal pad covered in transaction lists. I told them about standing in the doorway of an empty condo with the keys in my hand and understanding for the first time what it felt like to own something that was completely, uncontestably mine. And then I told them the thing I most needed them to hear. The people who exploit us financially, I said, almost never look like criminals. They look like the people who love us. They use the language of family and obligation and sacrifice. They say things like, "We thought you'd want to help, and you've always been the strong one, and we'll pay you back. We always pay you back." And we let them, many of us, for longer than we should, because we've been taught that love means making yourself available in whatever way the people you love require. We've been taught that needing to be needed is the same as being valued, that absorbing someone else's consequences is the same as being a good daughter, a good son, a good sibling. The room was very quiet. It isn't. I want to say that clearly, because I spent 9 years confusing those two things. Being used is not the same as being loved. Being indispensable is not the same as being cherished. And the moment someone takes something from you without asking, without your knowledge, without your consent, and then tells you that you should have expected it because you've always helped, that is the moment the line has been crossed. Not before. That moment. I paused. I looked at the woman in the third row who was writing something down now. Setting a limit with someone who has been taking from you is not an act of cruelty. Reporting a crime is not a betrayal of family. Protecting what you have built, your money, your credit, your financial identity, your sense of yourself as someone whose labor and generosity and hard work mean something, is not selfishness. It is the most basic form of self-respect, and it is something every person in this room deserves to practice without guilt. I thought about my parents on my doorstep in October. I thought about their attorney's phone calls. I thought about my mother's letters in her careful loopy cursive, and my father's single slow nod, and Lila saying, "That's more than I expected." "I'm not going to tell you that doing the right thing is easy," I said. "It isn't. I'm not going to tell you that it resolves cleanly, because it doesn't. There are mornings when I still reach for my phone, expecting a message from my mother, and feel the absence of it as something physical. There are moments when I am in the middle of something good, dinner with a friend, a Saturday morning in my own home, a conversation with someone I trust, and the grief of what my family was supposed to be arrives without warning and sits with me for a while. That doesn't go away on a schedule. It doesn't resolve just because the legal case is closed." I looked out at the room. "What does go away," I said, "is the feeling that you have no choice. That's what exploitation depends on. The belief that you cannot say no, that you cannot report it, that the cost of protecting yourself is too high because you will lose everything if you do. I want you to hear me say, from the other side of the hardest year of my life, the cost of not protecting yourself is higher, every time. Because what you lose when you finally stop absorbing and start setting limits is the illusion of a relationship that was never actually safe. And what you gain is something real." Yes. That evening, after the conference, Ethan picked me up outside the building. He was driving the truck he used for site visits, still wearing work clothes, and he'd brought coffee and thermoses because he knew I'd be tired and probably hadn't eaten since morning. He handed me one through the window when I climbed in without making a speech about it, the way he did things. Without ceremony, without requiring acknowledgement, just doing them because they were the right thing to do. We drove through the Seattle evening. The city was wet and lit and moving, all of it indifferent and beautiful in its indifference, and I held my thermos with both hands and let the warmth of it move through my palms. "How did it go?" he asked. "I went off my notes," I said. He glanced sideways at me. "Was that bad?" "I don't think so." I looked out at the city. I said what I actually meant instead of what I'd planned to say, and I think those turned out to be the same thing. That's usually better. Usually. He navigated a turn, quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" I thought about it honestly, the way I'd been learning to think about things. Not reaching for the composed answer, not the efficient answer, but the true one. "Before," I said. "When I was standing at the podium, but once I started talking to the room instead of at it, not really." He nodded. "You know what I think about when I'm doing a presentation on a building I care about?" "What?" "That the building already exists. In my head, in the drawings. It's already real. I'm just describing something that already is. The presenting is just translation." He paused. "I think you're probably doing that too. You're not constructing something in front of them. You're translating something that already happened." I looked at him for a moment. His profile in the light from the street, the comfortable certainty with which he drove, The way he said things like that and then just kept driving, not waiting for applause. That's a good way to think about it, I said. I have my moments. I leaned my head back against the seat. The coffee was good. The heater was running. Outside the windows, Seattle went about its evening. People walking in rain jackets, the glow of restaurants, a dog being walked on a long leash by someone jogging to keep up. All of it ordinary and specific and alive. I want to tell you that everything was resolved by then. I want to give you the version where the legal outcomes settled. All the accounts, and the family either healed or disappeared cleanly from the frame, and I arrived at a place of uncomplicated peace. But you've been with me through enough of this story to know that's not how it actually works. My parents were navigating their probation and their mandatory counseling and the civil repayment structure, and whatever it meant for them to be in their 60s, living inside the consequences of something they genuinely believed they were entitled to do. Lila was somewhere in Portland putting a life back together after a marriage that had lasted 7 months and collapsed under the weight of things she hadn't asked about. Grant Holloway was wherever he'd gone, carrying his own version of the year we'd all just been through. None of it was clean. What I had was this: a condo with a good paint job in a plant that was thriving, a job I'd earned and a title that matched it, a civil settlement that restored something real, a legal record that named correctly what had been done. A spreadsheet I no longer needed to keep because the accounts that required it were finally formally closed. A workshop curriculum I was building with Diane that was already reaching people who needed it. A man in a truck handing me coffee without making it a production. And something else. Something harder to name, but more important than any of the specifics. The knowledge that I had not disappeared. That's what I want to leave you with, because it's the thing I most wish I had understood 9 years earlier. That the people who treat your kindness as a resource are counting on one specific thing. They're counting on you needing their approval more than you need your own dignity. They're counting on the fear of being called selfish or cold or difficult being stronger than the impulse to protect yourself. They're counting on you choosing the pain of being used over the pain of being alone, because the pain of being used at least comes with the familiar shape of family around it. What they cannot survive is the moment you discover that you can be alone and intact, that the life you build without subsidizing everyone else's comfort is not smaller. It's finally the right size. That the relationships built on what you can provide will leave the moment you stop providing, which means they were never the relationships you thought they were. And the ones that don't leave, the ones that stay when you have nothing to offer but yourself, those are the ones worth building your life around. I know this because I am living it. Imperfectly, incompletely, with grief that still arrives uninvited, and mornings that are harder than they should be, and a relationship with my family that has no clear shape yet, and may never have the shape I wanted it to have. I know it not because I reached some elevated place above the pain, but because I'm still in the middle of my life. And the middle of my life is better than I thought it was going to be when I was sitting on the floor of a Saturday night office with a legal pad and a frozen credit card, and a family who had spent decades teaching me that my needs were the least important item on the list. They were wrong about that. It took me a long time to understand it, and even longer to act on it, and the acting on it cost me more than I'd expected and gave me more than I'd imagined. And if you're sitting somewhere right now recognizing something in this story, if you are the one who always helps, the one who is always strong, the one who is always available, the one who has a spreadsheet somewhere that you've never shown anyone because the number on it is too large and too sad to say out loud, then I want you to hear me say something directly to you. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to say, this is mine, and you cannot take it. You are allowed to call the bank, call the attorney, call the investigator, call the friend, call the workshop facilitator, call the person who makes you coffee without making it a thing, and say, I need help. Not because you're weak, not because you've given up on your family, but because you have spent long enough being the foundation everyone else built on without anyone asking if the foundation needed anything in return. The greatest victory I ever won had nothing to do with a court case or a civil settlement or a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was smaller than that, and it happened months before any of those things concluded. It was the moment I stopped making myself invisible so that other people could be seen. That was the beginning of everything that came after. And everything that came after was mine.